Thanks, Neil, and thanks, Neil and Joe, for organizing this wonderful conference, and thanks everyone for making time to come and listen to the talks. So today I'm going to talk about the perspectivity of instruments. In particular, I'm going to examine the claim that instruments are perspectival and try and find a way to, try and examine the different ways we can different and possibly best ways we can understand this claim. So after I'll walk you through some of the background for motivating this talk and some of the challenges that occur from the relevant background. I'll then introduce two novel responses to two challenges I will identify via two particular notions, one of broad perspectives and one of narrow perspectives. Cool. So I take scientific instruments to be any apparatus, simple or complex, used to investigate the natural world through observation and experimentation. And I take things like spectroscopes or microscopes or cloud chambers to be examples of scientific instruments. Right. So I take it that the kind of like objective or traditional view of scientific instruments is that they deliver knowledge about the world, and that this kind of knowledge is categorically not perspectival. It's like similarly to, well, perhaps not as strong as the absolutist view that Martin was talking about, but certainly a strong view about the kind of knowledge that we get from instruments and experimentations and so forth. So opposed to this view, I think there are kind of like two very old challenges discussed and examined very carefully and very nicely in Lauden's book about key controversies, which I strongly recommend to everyone. Anyway, so these two challenges to the objective view are as follows: conceptual relativism, according to which different perspectives construct the world differently, and there's kind of like there are no commonly established facts, and theory ladeness, according to which scientists' perspectives affect their observations or results, and there's no cross-perspectival knowledge. So, as I said, these are kind of like this is all more or less all news, and it's like familiar to a lot of people, I think. But something that may not be familiar to all of you is the perspectival view, which has been championed primarily by Ronald Geary and defended also by Paul Taylor and Michela Massimi and Alexander Reuger and a bunch of other people. In this talk, I'll primarily focus on Geary's view, because I think Geary is the only one to have made extensive, to my knowledge, to have made extensive remarks about scientific instruments. I will also refer to a paper by Michela from 2012, in which she also talks about instruments briefly. So anyway, the view, according to a scientific, the perspectival view on scientific instruments has as this kind of like primary claim the fact that scientific instruments are perspectival and deliver perspectival knowledge. So this is the claim that we want to examine and want to understand what it means, whether it's a kind of like novel challenge, whether it's a novel response to some old challenges. What exactly does it mean to say that instruments are perspectival, and what does it mean to have perspectival knowledge about the world? So I think there are at least two different ways in which we can understand the perspectivity of instruments. One way is to think that scientific instruments have perspectival features. So such perspectival features would be a response to a limited range of aspects of their environment. So this is the idea that telescopes, for example, cannot detect positrons because it's not within their energy range to do so. Another kind of like perspectival aspect of, or maybe I shouldn't do the quotes, a perspectival aspect of perspectival feature of scientific instruments is also the fact that they have limited responses to a limited range. So this is the idea that part of the perspective of any instrument is determined by its built-in margin of error. Peter Evans also talks a bit about this in his recent Perspectival Objectivity paper, and he construes this particular feature as a way of kind of like circumscribing the particular perspective from which the kind of like circumscribing more or less our relationship to scientific instruments and explicating what that entails. A third kind of feature of perspectival instruments that Geary identifies is the limitations on limitations on input discriminations, and I believe that this kind of limitations are to do with theory lateness and can lead to problematic challenges, which I will talk about, hopefully, if I have time towards the end of the talk. So, as I said, there are kind of like two different ways in which we can understand the claim that instruments are perspectival. One is to understand it as a claim about the perspectival feature of scientific instruments. The other way is to understand it as a kind of claim about the dependence on different kinds, the dependence of instruments on different kinds of perspectives. So here there are quite a few candidates that one might consider. So we may think that scientific instruments are dependent on the personal point of view, the human point of view, or a visual point of view. So I think the first two are kind of, well, limitation, like acknowledging ways of acknowledging the limitations of scientific instruments and circumscribing their particular limits from which they can deliver knowledge and to whom they can deliver knowledge. The third perspective, the visual point of view, I don't think it's particularly related to scientific instruments. Briefly, this is because you can easily imagine two people with different kind of like, visual systems, and they could look through the same instruments at the same object, but still see the world differently. And that's not because of the instruments, that's because of their visual system. So I think this kind of like three first perspectives are not necessarily, they don't seem to kind of like fully explain to us why instruments are perspectival, or there's something not quite satisfactory about understanding the perspectivity of instruments in this particular way. So other kind of like more useful ways of understanding the perspectivity of instruments would be as being dependent on ways of constructing models or particular cultures, or the standpoint of a scientific community, or the observational standpoint of an observer or instrument. So whilst I think that these are kind of like useful insights coming from Geary, I don't think they're particularly well explicated in his work, and I also think that they're rather coarse-grained. So I will not focus on these perspectives. I'll focus instead on two finer-grained notions of perspectives, broad perspectives, which I associate with the work of Michaela, two particular papers from 2018, and I'll explain in a second why Lauden features there as a reference to, and narrow perspectives, which are something that Michaela discussed in a paper from 2012, though not under this name, and something I've talked about in a recent paper. Okay, so cool. So the claim here is that scientific instruments, like the best way to understand scientific instruments is as being dependent on different kinds of perspectives, And I have identified two kind of like fine-grained notions of perspectives, broad perspectives and narrow perspectives. And I'm trying to show what exactly follows from this dependence, whether some kind of like novel epistemic challenge follows, or whether there's a novel solution to already existing problems that can be extracted from this kind of dependence. So we'll start with broad perspectives, and then if time permitted, we'll move on to narrow perspectives. Cool. So I understand broad perspective as being similar to research traditions, so hence the Loudon reference. I understand them in particular as sponsoring methodological norms, background assumptions, narrow perspectives, theories about phenomena, theories about instruments, their operation, and their interpretation. So I think this is, to some extent, well, so this is also what I take Michaela to understand. Well, this is also similar to what Michaela takes perspectives to be, or at least some perspectives, because there are also synchronic perspectives coming from modeling that she talks about, but that's something that I'll put aside for the time being. So Michaela defines broad perspective, what I take to be broad perspectives, as the body of scientific knowledge claims advanced by the scientific community at the time, the experimental, theoretical, and technological resources available to the scientific community at the time to reliably make those scientific knowledge claims, and second-order methodological epistemic claims that can justify the scientific knowledge claims so advanced. So if we try to understand the relationship between broad perspectives and scientific instruments, I take it that to begin with, each broad perspective can produce through its instruments and the elements it sponsors its own sort of conceptualization of the world. Broad perspectives, as I said, sponsor kind of methodological norms, and I take objectivity standards to be such methodological norms. Objectivity standards are particularly instructive and relevant in connection to scientific instruments because they seem to govern the whole use of scientific instruments and the way they're embedded in experiments and so forth. And they're also kind of, given the fact that they're govern the use of instruments, I think if they are perspectival, so instruments depend on objectivity standards are part of the broad perspectives. The dependence of instruments on objectivity standards might be problematic if objectivity standards turn out to be perspectival in the way just described. So then the attending challenge that would emerge from understanding the dependence of scientific instruments on broad perspectives would be a kind of instrumental incommensurability. So the claim is that if and when broad perspectives change, and such change leads to either knowledge of instrument building and operation, or knowledge delivered by instruments to become essentially non-transferable from one perspective to the next, instrumental incommensurability would occur. And there are, in principle, at least 3 different ways in which instrumental incommensurability can occur. I think the 3 ways are, in principle, there can be physical non-transferability of instruments from one broad perspective to the next. As much as I struggled to find examples here, I could not, because we can't really know about things that were lost. There can be technical non-transferability between broad perspectives. And here, I would strongly advise, so Peter Gallison talks about kind of like quite interesting and fascinating cases of technical continuity between broad perspectives in his book Image and Logic. And Mark Hicks talks about technical discontinuity occurring when at Bletchley Park when they sort of dismantled the computers. Is it the Colossus? I think it was the Colossus. Cool. A third way in which you can have instrumental incommensurability would be if you have conceptual non-transferability. So this would lead to the same. This would lead to the same kind of challenge, whereby scientific, like all the elements or at least elements that directly govern the use of instruments, such as objectivity standards, if they are perspectival, so if they are internal to broad perspectives and they change, then that would lead to a form of conceptual non-transferability of scientific instruments. Okay, so the kind of main argument that I want to suggest in relation to the dependence between scientific instruments and broad perspectives is to take perspectivism not as a novel challenge to scientific knowledge, but instead to take perspectivism as offering us the means to design a novel response to one old challenge, which is the conceptual relativism that comes from instrumental incommensurability. So this is how I'm thinking about the novel way to respond to conceptual relativism via kind of objectivity. I want to suggest that the scholarship, so there are kind of like three main claims. One, that the scholarship on the history of objectivity suggests that objectivity standards are not actually internal to broad perspectives. They're not tied to any particular broad perspectives, or so I will show in what follows. So even if objectivity standards which govern the use of instruments are perspectival, they are so in a much broader sense that would not lead to instrumental incommensurability. The second claim I want to establish is that when broad perspectives change, objectivity standards do not change concomitantly. And the third claim I want to establish is that scientific instruments and their outputs typically cut across both broad perspectives and changing objectivity standards. So the first two claims I will talk about are under the idea of this an objectivity-led response, and there's kind of like a separate instrument-led response. Okay, so the objectivity-led response to instrumental incommensurability would be is the idea that is the idea that conceptual relativism, which is brought about by the instrumental incommensurability, can be avoided with respect to scientific instruments as long as shifts in objectivity are not abrupt and discontinuous and do not correspond to shifts in broad perspectives. So that would be the main claim. So the way I would like to show this is by going through some of the scholarship on the history of objectivity, in particular going through the four main types of objectivity proposed by or researched by Dustin and Gallison in their book Objectivity. So the goal here is to show that we can use this scholarship to avoid conceptual relativism brought about by instrumental incommensurability. Okay, so the first standard of objectivity that Dustin and Gallison talk about is truth to nature. This is a standard that was particularly predominant in the 17th and 18th century, and it concerned standardized types. So this meant for the practitioners back then, it meant that the variability in nature, or the kind of like unruly tokens, have had fleeting features and would not give an accurate or true description of nature. So to them, the unreasoned observations were subjective, whereas the kind of like what Dustin and Gallison called the idea in the observation was objective. So this is the idea that by having, as you can see in the you see in these lovely pictures of specimens of snow, you have selected particular types which you have perfected into an archetype, and this can stand truly for the whole class of the specimens. And that's the kind of idea behind truth to nature. Sorry, I'm going to go quite briefly through this. I hope there's still enough. Well, I think there's still enough to kind of like make my main point. I'm happy to chat more about this in the Q&A. Okay, so the second standard of objectivity, which roughly which took hold, I suppose, in the 1830s and kind of was predominant for nearly a century up to the 1920s, is mechanical objectivity. And this was so directly responding to truth to nature, and going to a large extent going against it. This is the idea of proceduralized automation, and what the practitioners who upheld mechanical objectivity tried to do was to recuperate the variability of the individuals, right? They thought that you can only have a true image of the world if you represent the world in all its diversity, and you should suppress the predilection to prettify or idealize or create an archetype, and you can obtain this kind of like variability which is truer, which is the only way to think truly about nature, by mechanized procedures, or if that's not available, you can try and suppress the will of the practitioners. So they had this idea of will-less machines that would record truthfully and mechanically aspects of nature. So if you look at so this is a picture of snowflakes from 1902, and instead of the perfectly idealized archetypes, you have unruly tokens, which are not perfect, like here or here, where they don't kind of have the same kind of like lines or anything. So obviously, whilst this was kind of like an interesting attempt to represent nature in all its splendor, and to represent it truthfully, there were kind of like there were big trade-offs, because you can't recuperate color with color, for example, or depth of field with a lot of mechanized procedures. So there was still a lot of there was still a lot of room for kind of like human intervention and selection and idealization too. Opposed to kind of like developing alongside mechanical objectivity, and opposed to both mechanical objectivity and truth to nature, was the idea of structural objectivity, which developed around the 1880s, and then kind of like was predominant again alongside mechanical objectivity till the 1920s. And structural objectivity implied the idea of communicable invariance. James talked a bit about this yesterday. So behind the idea of structural objectivity was the idea that enduring structural relationships that survive mathematical transformation, scientific revolution, shifts of linguistic perspective, cultural diversity, psychological evolution, the vagaries of history, and the quirks of individual physiology was the only way to kind of like obtain scientific objectivity about scientific objectivity, and that you could only have objectivity if the kind of features you thought were objective could be invariable and communicable to one and all. Maybe this is a too strong a notion for what James had in mind yesterday, but this is kind of like certainly one ideal of objectivity that developed in the late 19th century. And finally, the fourth standard of objectivity that Dustin and Gallison talk about is trained judgment, which developed not only in response to previous standards of objectivity, but also in response to increasingly complex scientific instrumentation. So trained judgment developed in around the mid-20th century, and it implied the idea of, it had as its basis, I suppose, the idea of skilled interpretation. So according to the practitioners who upheld trained judgment as a standard of objectivity, skills had to be acquired through sophisticated apprenticeship, and such skills were necessary to synthesize, highlight, and grasp relationships, to smooth, refine, or classify images, to read, to interpret, to draw salient, significant structures from the morass of uninteresting artifact and background. So what was sought was the human ability to seize pattern and obtain knowledge at a glance. And if you look in the picture of the Fowler brothers, those are cloud chamber photographs, which I don't think you can identify significant events without trained judgment to do so. This is something I'll come back to briefly later on. Okay, so I've talked about broad perspectives as sponsoring objectivity standards which govern the use of instruments. And I've suggested that if objectivity standards which govern the use of instruments were to be perspectival in a strong sense and were to change from one broad perspective to another, then to some extent or to a large extent, scientific instruments would be, in a sense, truly perspectival, internal only to a particular broad perspectives, and truly, or to some extent, truly incommensurable to one another. Now, I've used the scholarship on history of objectivity to show that the objectivity standards which govern the use of instruments are actually not discontinuous to one another. They survive alongside one another, even if they're not necessarily predominant alongside one another. And I will also show briefly in what follows that they're not actually, that objectivity standards are not actually changing concomitantly to broad perspectives either. They're broader than broad perspectives to some extent. Anyway, so here are the first take-home lessons related to the objectivity-led response to instrumental incommensurability. So the first lesson is that objectivity standards are not inherently tied to any particular broad perspective, nor do they necessarily change concomitantly to any broad perspective. What I just said. On the contrary, older standards can survive alongside succeeding predominant standards, even past the predominance of the succeeding standards. Even if the objectivity standards are perceived as in some way perspectival, continuity in objectivity standards over and above changes in broad perspectives should suffice to avert perspectivism as conceptual relativism in relation to scientific instruments. And objectivity shifts should also be noted that objectivity shifts do not correspond to shifts in proper perspective. And here you can think about, I think there are many examples. One example would be the you could conceive as the Lorentzian ether theory and the special relativity as being different proper perspectives. They were both governed by structural objectivity. So when, to some extent, when we changed from Lorentzian ether theory to special relativity, the objectivity standard didn't change, which means that objectivity standards don't change concomitantly to broad perspectives. So whilst broad perspectives endorse objectivity standards, they don't necessarily create the objectivity standards. Cool. So now you may worry that broad perspectives are actually broader, and that the objectivity standards themselves define the broad perspectives. And when they change, then the instruments and their deliverances, outputs, data would also change. So the idea here is that the instruments would change, would still change, even if they don't change with broad perspectives. So I have two responses to this. Well, I have an instrument-led response to this worry, which will come in two parts. So just to clarify what's going on, the idea is that instruments and their outputs typically the crux of the response would be that instruments and their outputs typically do not change when objectivity standards change. When objectivity standards shift, scientists who adhere to new predominant standards can nevertheless use instruments designed according to previous objectivity standards, and the outcomes of such instruments are not typically contested either. So I will now kind of like talk about these latter two claims by referring to some examples. So the first part of the response that's instrument-led consists in the fact that what I want to establish is that instruments and their deliverances can be markedly cross-perspectival, even when perspectives are defined by the objectivity standards themselves. That is, even when the perspectives are broader than broad perspectives. So I think the idea is that despite being built or used to deliver data under the sponsorship of one objectivity standard, the instrument and the data produced often successfully survive shifts in objectivity standards. Auspices is a word that is nicer written than pronounced, I suppose. Anyway, so the example I kind of like want to talk a bit about to demonstrate these two claims is the cloud chamber, and if what I want to show basically is that the cloud chamber, I mean, like if you look at the history of the cloud chamber, you can track the cloud chamber through changing objectivity standards, through changing broad perspectives, yet its significance and the significance of particular deliverances like the positron picture has not changed despite all these other changes. So the cloud chamber was invented by, actually I don't think it was invented by C.T.R. Wilson, but it was perfected by C.T.R. Wilson in the form that was then appropriated by physicists at Cavendish to be used in particle physics. So initially, C.T.R. Wilson and I forget what the name of the other person who, you can, Peter Gallison has a very nice paper on this in The Uses of Experiments, from which I draw most of the historical detail. So the story of the cloud chamber, as we know it, and as it's relevant to the picture of the positron on the slide, starts with C.T.R. Wilson, who used it primarily to reproduce or mimic atmospheric phenomena. So the cloud chamber was invented by C.T.R. Wilson, or the Wilson cloud chamber was invented under the sponsorship of mechanical objectivity to record mimetically or to reproduce mimetically atmospheric phenomena. This was towards the end of the 19th century. I'm trying to remember the exact date, but I cannot at the moment. So that was kind of like it was invented, and the Wilson obtained with the cloud chamber, besides the kind of atmospheric phenomena, is sort of slowly shifted towards particle physics, and he first obtained the picture of the alpha particle. I think that was 1912 or 1913, and I don't have a picture of it, but it looked to some extent as the positron picture here, and that gave rise to a whole tradition of what it's called, to a whole tradition of golden events, which stand for the recording of subatomic phenomena on by photographic images to a large extent. So this particular picture here of the positron taken by Carl Anderson in 1933 and showing the clear track of a positron, that's a golden event. So to cut a long story short, the idea with the cloud chamber gave rise to, was invented under the sponsorship of mechanical objectivity, then produced golden events under the auspices of mechanical objectivity, and slowly kind of like progressed, was improved to produce more golden events under the auspices of Train's judgment, and it's still like, and later on, I think in the 60s, and the important lesson to retain here is that neither the cloud chamber was not called into question despite shifts in broad perspectives or objectivity standards, and neither were neither was its significance. So the fact that it can produce golden events, those are things that survived shifts of objectivity standards and broad perspectives. Okay, I'm happy to answer more questions about the cloud chamber in the Q&A, but let us now move on to stellar spectra, which is another example by which I mean to show that the significance and integrity of data, to some extent, produced by instruments, can retain its, so we can retain the integrity of data and their significance despite despite shifting objectivity standards. So the idea is that even when certain instruments become obsolete, their deliverances retain their original authority despite shifts in objectivity standards. And I'm not sure how much time I have, but I want to move on to theory ladeness too. So I'll just say that the photographic plates of the spectra of stars that became available towards the end of the 19th century with the invention of the spectroscope cut across shifting objectivity standards. What this means and why I have this lovely picture of Antonia Mori, Wilhelmina Fleming, Annie J. Cannon, and a number of other human computers at the Harvard Observatory is because they were essential to classifying stars towards the end of 19th century. And they did so by analyzing stellar spectra plates under the sponsorship or with whilst being governed to some extent by mechanical objectivity. And despite the focus on mechanical objectivity in analyzing and compiling the catalog of stellar spectra, the significance of the stellar spectra and the classification was nonetheless, remained nonetheless integral or retained its authority with shifts in objectivity standards. So from the move to the Henry Draper catalog to the Morgan Cleenan and Kelman catalog, which was designed in 1943 under the sponsorship of trained judgment. Okay.
Just to let you know, you've had 42 minutes.
Okay. Okay, so I'll go through the take-home lessons, and unfortunately I won't have time to talk about the narrow perspectives, but I am happy to share the preprint that I have, and there's a link actually at the end. So take-home lessons in relation to the objectivity-led response to instrumental incommensurability, which can lead to conceptual relativism, are the following. Changes in objectivity standards have not transformed or denied the significance of either the cloud chamber or their spectrographs. Conceptual relativism can be avoided when instruments and their deliverances survive shifts in both broad perspectives and objectivity standards. And scientific instruments themselves and the standards of objectivity governing them equally constitute tools to block conceptual relativism brought about by instrumental incommensurability. I will not talk about narrow perspectives because I don't have time, but there's a link here to the preprint if you wish to read about this. And thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Anna. Yeah, sorry about the time signals. I put them in the chat because I didn't want to interrupt you. I think my desire not to interrupt you may have been too successful.
I should have said that you should have jumped in, but yeah, no worries.
Anyway,
I hope there's still some time for questions.
Yes, no, we've still got a good bit of time for Q&A. I'll stop the recording there.